Okay, in this series of videos, I'm going to show you how to configure an ACI feature called Golf that has to do with scaling WAN connectivity out of the fabric and bringing a form of automation between ACI and some external Golf routers. So I will very quickly explain, what is Golf doing for me? Why did we come up with this feature in the first place? So if you're familiar with ACI, when you want to connect, traffic outside the fabric, one of the ways in which you can do that is called a layer 3 out. And a layer 3 out is just a neighbor adjacency, either with a dynamic routing protocol or static routes from the ACI fabric border leaves to some external router. It could be any router. It doesn't have to be anything that's owned or controlled by ACI. And you normally do this on a per VRF level. So if you only have one VRF, you create one layer 3 out, Golf probably isn't for you. But if, let's say, you're a service provider and you have many tenants and many VRFs, and you don't want to create the configuration overhead of a layer 3 out per VRF when you may have hundreds or thousands of VRFs that you're supporting, you want to look at using Golf as a way to scale your WAN connectivity into ACI. So instead of creating a layer 3 out per VRF per tenant from the border leaves, what Golf will do is we will create a layer 3 out in tenant infra between the spines and what will be the Golf routers, and we'll create that adjacency and be able to use route descriptors and route targets for all of our user tenants to be able to ride this BGP, this MP BGP connection in tenant infra, and thereby allowing us to simplify configuration and scale the number of layer 3 outs and VRFs out of ACI in a very graceful fashion. The other feature that Golf brings is a level of automation. We want to be able to configure the external Golf routers, which are not controlled, owned, or managed by ACI, but we want to automate the configuration of the WAN integration as it relates to Golf. So just those ports and those features that are related to this, this peering and this VRF connectivity through the Golf routers. So that's the second feature that Golf brings. So scale and automation. So there's a couple of design choices you have in terms of topology, and the image that you see here is probably the most simple. I have one ACI fabric, two spines, two leaves, nothing fancy here. You can see in the middle I've got a layer of Golf routers, so I've got two Golf routers here for redundancy. But each of the Golf routers will form an MP BGP connection to each of the spines, right? This is probably the most simplest deployment option. If you have multipod, we do support Golf with multipod. A lot of people get confused about Golf and multipod. They're really two different solutions, but they're very complementary to each other. So for the rest of these series of videos, I'm actually going to show you Golf with multipod because that's how my lab is set up. I want to point out this picture is a picture of my lab, but it is not the recommended production grade design because you can obviously see that I'm lacking redundancy. I've only got one spine in each pod, one IPN device, etc. You would want to consult the official configuration guide from Cisco to do everything the proper way. But for the purposes of a working example, this is just fine to show you how it all works. So as you can see here, I've got multi-pod. I've got pod 1 to the left, pod 2 to the right. Notice the IP addresses. These are loopbacks, so all 1s for spine 1, all 2s for spine 2. I already have multipod up and running and connected, so you see my IPN devices are already configured and multipod is working. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect my Golf routers to my IPN devices. So you have the option to connect your Golf routers directly to the spine, or if you have multipod like I do, you can connect to the IPN devices, set up an OSPF adjacency between the Golf router and the IPN device, and then on top of that, configure an MP BGP connection, which is multi-hop aware, directly to the spine, and that's exactly what we're going to do. Each of the Golf routers will build an MP BGP connection to each of the spines. So when we're all done, we'll actually have 4 BGP sessions between the spines and the Golf routers. Note the IP addresses of the Golf devices here. These are the loopbacks of Golf West and Golf East. I have an optional BGP MPLS-PE router that has nothing to do with Golf. It is not controlled or configured by ACI in any way, but it's going to be useful that we'll see later on in the following videos when we want to test connectivity, which way do routes go, which way does traffic flow. So that's just a useful way to test here. It's optional in your particular case. In ACI, after we configure the Golf devices, we're going to build a tenant with a VRF, and we're going to call that VRF Joe, and we're going to see all of the configuration related to that VRF Joe in ACI automatically show up in the Golf router, and then from the MPLS-PE router, which is already pre-configured for this VRF, we'll be able to see how traffic flows. So in the rest of these videos, we're going to break it down. So you can look at Golf configuration as a multi-stage process. So for my particular multi-pod topology example, these are the steps that I'm going to go through. If you are using a different topology, like not using multi-pod or connecting your Golf routers directly to the spines, there's going to be some other additional day zero configurations that I'm not showing here, but effectively you're going to have to create that layer 3 out somewhere. In my particular example, I am going to borrow and ride on top of the existing layer 3 out in tenant infra that I'm already using for multipod. That is perfectly legal and actually makes the configuration super easy in ACI. So the first stage is really the one-time day zero configuration that you'll do in the Golf routers and in ACI. You only have to do it once and never have to worry about it again. So we're going to configure that in the next video, and we'll show what that looks like. Once you've got that set up, then you can create new additional, what I'll call kind of placeholder layer 3 outs in each of your user tenants, and that's a recurring configuration. So again, if you're bringing on a lot of new tenants with their own VRFs, you're going to have to do some really basic configuration in order to get their VRFs to show up automatically in the Golf router and WAN integration to be complete. And then in a future video, we'll actually show the ingress and egress optimization because there are some interesting things to be aware of depending on your topology.